Hello everyone, thank you for taking the time to watch my presentation. Today I'm discussing one of the most critical human rights issues of our time, human trafficking. This research journey has been eye-opening and has deepened my understanding of the factors that allow trafficking to thrive and the steps that we can take to fight it. By examining a few comprehensive and peer-reviewed sources, I was able to uncover the global scale of the problem, the challenges faced by the victims, and the efforts, both successful and flawed, that aim to address it. Through this research, I've come to learn the complexities of human trafficking. It isn't just about the exploitation, it's also about the systems, policies, and vulnerabilities that traffickers exploit. From economic instability to the role of prostitution laws and legal enforcement, there is quite a lot to unpack. So let's dive into what I've learned. So, one of the first things that stood out to me was the global scale of human trafficking and the diversity of its victims. According to the Global Report on Trafficking in Persons by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, millions of people worldwide are affected by trafficking annually. Victims include women and children who are usually and disproportionately targeted for sexual exploitation, and men who are often forced into labor. What's particularly disturbing is how traffickers exploit vulnerable groups. For instance, those fleeing conflict or poverty will often fall victim to traffickers who promise them safety or employment, but instead they coerce them into exploitation. The Understanding People Smuggling and Human Trafficking report states that trafficking thrives in regions with economic instability, political unrest, and weak legal system. This makes it clear that trafficking is not an isolated crime, but a symptom of deeper systemic issues. The International Labor Organization's synthesis report also pointed out how trafficking patterns adapt to global trends. For example, the COVID-19 pandemic disrupted monitoring systems and increased online trafficking as traffickers shifted to digital platforms to exploit these victims. This shows that human trafficking is not static, but it does indeed evolve with global challenges, making it a pretty complex issue to address. A key aspect of my research was understanding how prostitution laws impact human trafficking. The connection between the two is highly debated, with evidence showing that laws can either deter trafficking or exacerbate it depending on how they're implemented. The Global Report on Trafficking in Persons highlighted that in countries where prostitution is legalized, there is often an increase in trafficking for sexual exploitation. The logic is pretty straightforward. Legalization can increase the demand, and traffickers will always step in to meet that demand. However, countries like Sweden, who have implemented their own legal systems, have seen mixed results. On the one hand, these policies aim to reduce demand and support victims, but on the other hand, they can push sex work underground. This can make it harder to identify victims of trafficking, as noted in the International Labor Organization's synthesis report. This debate shows how complex the issue is, requiring nuanced policies tailored to specific cultural and economic contexts. In my research, I also encountered arguments which stress the need for victim-centered policies. For instance, simply punishing buyers doesn't address the systemic vulnerabilities that drive people into exploitation in the first place. This means that alongside legislation, there must be investments in social services, public education, and victim support systems. Another major takeaway was how the strength or weakness of legal systems affects trafficking. In regions with strong governance and anti-trafficking laws, there is a noticeable reduction in trafficking activity. For example, countries with well-coordinated anti-trafficking strategies, such as partnerships between law enforcement and NGOs, are better equipped to prosecute traffickers and support victims. However, in areas with weak legal systems like parts of sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia, trafficking goes rampant. The Global Report on Trafficking in Persons and the Understanding People Smuggling and Human Trafficking report both emphasize that traffickers exploit gaps in governance, corruption, and porous borders. For instance, corrupt officials often accept bribes or actively participate in trafficking networks, creating a system where traffickers operate with near impunity. One resource I used, called Human Trafficking and Exploitation, a Global Health Concern, also pointed out that weak legal systems struggle with victim rehabilitation. Victims are often re-traumatized by judicial processes or lack access to essential services like housing and counseling. This perpetuates cycles of vulnerability, making survivors more likely to be trafficked once again. One of the most significant lessons I've learned is that combating human trafficking requires a holistic approach. Legal systems and enforcement are critical, but they must be paired with strategies that address root causes like poverty, gender inequality, and displacement. I would like to emphasize the importance of community outreach programs and education campaigns to empower vulnerable populations. One thing that struck me was the importance of international cooperation. No single country can combat trafficking alone. The International Labor Organization Synthesis Report highlighted successful cross-border partnerships that disrupted trafficking networks and provided safe migration pathways for vulnerable groups. Similarly, global efforts to strengthen weak legal systems such as anti-corruption training and judicial reforms can go a long way in reducing trafficking risks. Ultimately, I will say that this research has taught me that while the fight against trafficking is complex, it is definitely not insurmountable. By addressing the vulnerabilities traffickers exploit and strengthening global systems of accountability, we can make real progress toward eradicating this heinous crime. Thank you for listening as I shared what I've learned throughout my research. Human trafficking is a multifaceted issue that demands attention, urgency, and collective action. I do hope this inspires you to think critically about how we can contribute to solutions, whether through advocacy, education, or simply just by raising awareness. Together we can make a difference. Thank you.